The December wind cut through paradise, Nevada like a blade, and Marcus Emmett saw her standing on the auction block without shoes, her bare feet pale against the rough wooden planks as the auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowded square, calling for bids on household goods and contract labor in a scene that made his stomach turn with disgust and something else he could not name. The year was 1883, and Paradise was a mining town that had seen better days, its silver veins running thin while its population of desperate souls only seemed to grow thicker. Marcus had ridden in 3 days prior with his 2 brothers, looking to purchase supplies before heading back to their cattle ranch in the high country. But now he stood frozen among the crowd, his dark eyes fixed on the young woman whose threadbare dress offered little protection against the biting cold that swept down from the Sierra Nevada mountains. She could not have been more than 22 years old, with long dark hair that hung in tangled waves around her thin shoulders and eyes that looked straight ahead, seeing nothing and everything at once. Her face bore the kind of hollow beauty that came from too many missed meals, and too many nights wondering if morning would bring relief or just more suffering. But it was her feet that held Marcus transfixed, those bare feet that must have been numb with cold, standing there as if she had already resigned herself to whatever fate the auction would bring. "Contract labor for 6 months, the auctioneer called out, a fat man in a stained vest who seemed entirely too pleased with himself. "Strong girl can cook and clean, no trouble at all. We will start the bidding at $20. Marcus felt his jaw clench. He knew what kind of contract labor this was, the kind where desperate women sold themselves into servitude to pay off debts or escape worse situations. The kind where the men who bought those contracts often expected services that had nothing to do with cooking or cleaning. He had seen it before in other towns, had always walked away with a bitter taste in his mouth and a prayer that someone decent would make the purchase. But this time he could not seem to make his feet move. $20, called out a voice from the left, and Marcus turned to see Bill Henderson, a mine supervisor known for working his contract laborers harder than his mules and treating them worse besides. The young woman's eyes flickered toward Henderson for just a moment, and Marcus saw something die in them, some last small flame of hope guttering out like a candle in a storm. Her hands, which had been clasped in front of her, began to tremble, though whether from cold or fear he could not say. 25. Another voice called, this one belonging to Samuel Worth, who ran a saloon on the edge of town where the girls who worked upstairs had eyes just as hollow as the one standing on that auction block. Marcus found himself pushing forward through the crowd before his mind had fully registered the decision his heart had already made. $50, he heard himself say, his voice carrying clear and strong across the square, and suddenly, every eye was on him instead of the girl. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. $50 from the gentleman in the back. That's mighty generous for 6 months of labor. Do I hear 55? Henderson scowled but shook his head, turning away with a curse. Worth studied Marcus for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this newcomer was competition for his business or just a fool with too much money. Then he too stepped back with a shrug. 50 going once, 50 going twice, sold to the gentleman for $50. The auctioneer's gavel cracked against his podium like a gunshot. And just like that, the young woman's fate was sealed. Marcus made his way to the front of the crowd, pulling the money from his coat pocket with hands that were steadier than he expected. Up close, he could see that her feet were not just pale but had taken on a dangerous bluish tinge at the toes, and there were cuts on her heels where the rough wood of the auction block had scraped away skin. His anger at whoever had put her up there in this condition burned hot and fierce in his chest. "Here is your payment," he said to the auctioneer, counting out the bills. "I will need the contract papers." Of course, of course." The auctioneer produced a sheaf of documents from his vest pocket, already filled out except for the buyer's name. "Just sign here and she is yours for the next 6 months, Mr. Emmett, Marcus Emmett." The pen scratched across paper, and then the auctioneer was handing the contract to Marcus with a smile that showed too many gold teeth. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Emmett. Stella, get down from there and go with your new employer." So her name was Stella. Marcus looked up at her, meeting those hollow eyes for the first time at close range, and saw that they were a deep brown shot through with flecks of gold, like whiskey held up to lamplight. "Miss Stella," he said quietly, keeping his voice gentle despite the fury still churning in his gut. "Let me help you down from there." He reached up to offer his hand, but she hesitated, searching his face for something he could not name. Then, slowly, she placed her small, cold hand in his larger, warm one and allowed him to steady her as she climbed down from the auction block. The moment her bare feet touched the frozen ground, she gasped and nearly stumbled, but Marcus caught her by the elbow. "You will walk in warmth from this day," he said, the words coming out like a vow he had not planned to make. Then, before she could respond or he could second-guess himself, he shrugged out of his heavy sheepskin coat and draped it around her shoulders. It swallowed her thin frame, hanging nearly to her knees, but the relief that flooded her face was immediate and profound. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse as if from long disuse or too much crying. "Sir, Marcus," he interrupted. "My name is Marcus, and you do not need to call me sir." He glanced down at her feet again, at the cuts that were starting to seep blood onto the ground, and made another quick decision. "We need to get you proper footwear and some warm clothes before we do anything else. Can you walk?" She nodded, but when she tried to take a step, her face went white and she swayed. Marcus caught her before she could fall, and then, without asking permission because he could see she would never give it, he simply swept her up into his arms and started walking toward the general store on the far side of the square. Stella made a small sound of protest but did not struggle, perhaps because she was too cold and weak, or perhaps because she had learned long ago that struggling rarely changed anything. Marcus was a tall man, broad through the shoulders from years of ranch work, and she weighed almost nothing in his arms. That realization made his anger burn even hotter, though he kept it carefully banked behind a calm expression. "Where are you taking me?" she asked as he navigated around a freight wagon and nearly collided with a miner leading a mule. "To get you boots and a proper dress," he replied. "And food. When did you last eat?" She was silent for so long that he thought she might not answer, but then she said quietly, "Yesterday morning." "Some bread." "Yesterday morning." Marcus felt something twist in his chest. "Well, that will not do at all. After we get you outfitted, we are going to the restaurant and you are going to have a proper meal." "But the expense," she started to say, and he could hear the protest building in her voice, the resistance of someone who had learned to expect nothing and trust less. "Is mine to worry about," he finished firmly. "You just worry about getting warm and getting fed. Everything else will sort itself out." The general store was blessedly warm after the bitter cold of the street, a pot-bellied stove in the corner radiating heat that made Stella sigh with relief as Marcus set her down in a chair near it. The proprietor, a wizened old man named Chen who had come to Nevada during the railroad boom and stayed when his restaurant failed, looked up from behind his counter with interest. "Mr. Emmett," he greeted with a slight bow. "What can I do for you this fine afternoon?" "I need boots for the lady," Marcus said, gesturing to Stella, whose feet were now clearly visible in the lamplight and looked even worse than he had thought. "And warm stockings and a proper dress and a coat of her own and whatever else she needs." Chen's eyes flickered to Stella's bare feet and then to her face, and something like understanding passed across his weathered features. "Of course, miss, if you would permit me to measure your foot." He produced a measuring stick and knelt before Stella with a grace that belied his age. Stella looked at Marcus, uncertainty written in every line of her body, and he nodded encouragingly. "It is all right. Mr. Chen is an honest merchant. He will treat you fairly." She extended one foot hesitantly, wincing as Chen examined the cuts on her heel. "These need to be cleaned," he said, his English accented but clear. "I have salve that will help. One moment." He disappeared into the back room and returned with a basin of warm water, clean cloths, and a small tin of something that smelled of herbs and honey. What followed was a quiet domestic scene that felt strange to Marcus. Standing there in that warm store while Chen gently cleaned and bandaged Stella's feet, then measured them and disappeared into his stockroom to find boots that would fit. Stella sat very still through it all, her hands twisted in the fabric of Marcus's coat, her eyes downcast as if she could not quite believe this was happening. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You could have bought the contract and just—" "Most men would have." She did not finish the sentence, but she did not need to. Marcus crouched down in front of her chair so that he could meet her eyes at level. "Most men are not worth the powder it would take to blow them to hell," he said bluntly. "I bought your contract to keep you away from Henderson and Worth, not to take advantage of you. You will work at my family's ranch, doing honest labor for fair treatment, and when your 6 months are up, you will be free to go wherever you please with money in your pocket and a good reference in your hand. That is the deal, and I give you my word on it." Stella stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her trying to decide whether to believe him, weighing his words against whatever experiences had taught her that men could not be trusted. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Your word, then," she said. "I will hold you to it." "Please do," Marcus replied, and found that he meant it more than he had meant anything in a long time. Chen returned with an armload of items. Sturdy leather boots lined with sheepskin, thick wool stockings, a simple but well-made dress in a deep blue that would suit Stella's coloring, and a coat made for winter weather with a hood and deep pockets. "This should serve," he said, laying everything out on the counter. "The dress may need some alteration, but it is the smallest I have. For undergarments and other necessities, my wife has a selection in the back if the lady would like to see them." Stella's cheeks colored, but she nodded, and Mrs. Chen appeared as if summoned. A tiny bird-like woman with kind eyes who took one look at Stella and began clucking sympathetically. She led Stella behind a curtain, and Marcus could hear their voices, Mrs. Chen's brisk and practical, Stella's hesitant and soft. "You did a good thing today," Chen said quietly, beginning to tally up the purchases. "Henderson would have worked her to death in his mines, or Worth would have put her upstairs in his saloon. Either way, 6 months from now there would have been nothing left of the girl you see now." "I know," Marcus said grimly. "Who put her up for auction? How did she end up in that situation?" Chen shrugged. "I do not know the whole story, only that she arrived in Paradise 2 weeks ago on the stage, saying she was to meet her brother who had worked in the mines. But when she got here, she found out her brother had been killed in a collapse 3 months earlier. She had no money to go back, nowhere to go at all. She tried to find work, but you know how it is. No one wants to hire a woman alone, not for honest work. She ended up owing money for room and board at the boarding house, and Mrs. Patterson sold her contract to cover the debt." Marcus felt his hands curl into fists. He knew Mrs. Patterson, a sour-faced widow who ran the boarding house with an iron fist and no mercy. "How much did she owe?" $20, Chen said, and the contempt in his voice was clear. Mrs. Patterson sold a 6-month contract for a $20 debt that was only 2 weeks old. $20. Marcus had just paid $50 for that same contract, and he would have paid $100 to keep Stella off that auction block. But the knowledge that she had been sold into servitude for such a paltry sum made him want to ride back to the boarding house and give Mrs. Patterson a piece of his mind. But that would accomplish nothing except to make him feel better, and right now Stella needed him focused on practical matters. The curtain rustled, and Stella emerged, transformed. The blue dress fit her reasonably well, though it hung a bit loose on her thin frame, and the coat sat squarely on her shoulders with the hood pushed back to reveal her face. She wore the wool stockings and the sheepskin boots, and though she walked gingerly on her damaged feet, there was color in her cheeks now and something like hope beginning to kindle in her eyes. "Better?" Marcus asked, and she nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Much better." "Thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Chen." Marcus paid for the purchases, adding a warm scarf and gloves to the pile at the last moment, and then he bundled up Stella's old dress and his coat. "Is there anything else you need from the boarding house?" he asked. "Any belongings you left there?" She shook her head. "I had almost nothing when I arrived, and what little I had, Mrs. Patterson kept when she sold my contract, said it was part of what I owed her. Of course she did." Marcus swallowed another surge of anger and offered Stella his arm. "Then let us get you that meal I promised, and then we will head to the hotel where my brothers and I are staying. Tomorrow morning we will start for the ranch." The restaurant was busy with the afternoon crowd, miners and merchants, and the occasional rancher grabbing a hot meal before heading back out into the cold. Marcus found them a table near the back, away from the main flow of traffic, and ordered enough food for 3 people. Beef stew thick with vegetables, fresh bread with butter, apple pie, and hot coffee. When the food arrived, Stella stared at it as if she could not quite believe it was real. "I cannot eat all this," she said, but Marcus saw the way her hands trembled as she reached for the bread. "Eat what you can," he said simply. "We will wrap up the rest for later." She ate slowly at first, as if her stomach had forgotten what food was for, but as the warmth of the stew and the substance of the bread hit her system, she began to eat with more enthusiasm. Marcus watched her from across the table, sipping his coffee and picking at his own bowl of stew, and tried to imagine what circumstances had brought her to Paradise and that auction block. "You do not have to tell me if you do not want to," he said after a while, "but I am curious about your story. Mr. Chen said you came here looking for your brother." Stella's spoon paused halfway to her mouth, and for a moment Marcus thought she would refuse to answer. But then she set the spoon down and met his eyes, and he saw a kind of weary resignation there, as if she had told this story before and expected not to be believed. "My name is Stella Morrison," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "I am from a small town in Colorado, outside of Denver. My parents died of influenza when I was 16, and my older brother Daniel and I were left to fend for ourselves. Daniel worked odd jobs for a few years, but he had always dreamed of striking it rich in the silver mines, so 2 years ago he came west to Nevada. He wrote to me regularly at first, sending money when he could, and in his last letter he said he had steady work in the mines near Paradise and that I should come join him. He said he had saved enough that we could start over together, maybe open a shop or buy some land." She paused to take a sip of coffee, and Marcus saw the tightness around her eyes that meant this next part hurt to tell. "I sold everything I had and bought a stage ticket. It took every penny I had saved, but Daniel had sent me the fare and said he would take care of the rest once I arrived. But when I got here and asked for Daniel Morrison at the mining office, they told me he had been killed in a collapse. They gave me his final wages, which was $11, and that was all I had in the world. "I am sorry," Marcus said, and meant it. He had lost his own father to a horse-riding accident 3 years ago, and knew the particular hollowness that came with unexpected death. Stella nodded, accepting his sympathy with a grace that spoke to strength beneath her fragile appearance. "I tried to find work. I went to every business in town, offered to clean, cook, mend clothes, anything. But no one wanted to hire a woman alone with no references and no family. They all looked at me like I was trouble waiting to happen, or like I was something else entirely." Her voice hardened on those last words, and Marcus understood what she meant. "Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house was the only one who would take me in," Stella continued. "She said I could stay there and work off my room and board by helping with the cleaning and cooking. But the work never seemed to be enough to cover what she said I owed. After 2 weeks, she told me I owed her $20 and that she was going to sell my contract at the auction to recover her costs. I begged her for more time, promised I would work harder, but she said her mind was made up." "And so you ended up on that auction block," Marcus finished grimly. "And so I ended up on that auction block," Stella agreed. "I knew what would happen. I saw Henderson and Worth in the crowd, recognized them from around town. I knew whoever bought my contract would expect." She trailed off, her cheeks coloring again. "I had resigned myself to it. 6 months of whatever hell awaited me, and then maybe I would be free to start over somewhere else. But then you bid, and you paid more than anyone else was willing to pay, and I did not know what to think." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her face in the lamplight. She was beautiful, he realized, or would be once she had some regular meals and rest, and the fear faded from her eyes. But it was not her beauty that had made him bid. It was something else, some quality of quiet strength that refused to be extinguished even in the face of impossible circumstances, some spark that reminded him of his mother, who had come west as a young bride and carved a home out of wilderness through sheer force of will. "I bid because it was the right thing to do," he said, "and because I have 2 younger sisters back at the ranch, and I would hope that if they ever found themselves in such a situation, some decent man would step up to help them." "You have sisters?" Stella asked, and there was real interest in her voice now, curiosity breaking through the walls she had built around herself. "2," Marcus confirmed. "Martha is 19 and wild as a March hare. She can outride most of the ranch hands and is not afraid to prove it. And Rebecca is 17 and wants to be a school teacher, spends all her time reading books and writing in her journals. They are both at the ranch with my brothers, Thomas and William. Thomas is 26 and manages the day-to-day operations while I handle the business side of things. William is 24 and thinks he is a gambler, though he is terrible at cards and we all know it." Stella smiled at that, a real smile that transformed her face and made Marcus's heart do an unexpected flip in his chest. "They sound like quite a family," she said. "They are," Marcus agreed. "Our father died 3 years ago, and our mother passed when Rebecca was just a baby, so we have all had to look after each other. The ranch is all we have, but it is a good spread with clean water and decent grazing land. We run about 500 head of cattle and break horses on the side. It is hard work, but honest work, and there is always enough food on the table and a warm bed at night." "And that is where you are taking me," Stella said. It was not quite a question, but Marcus heard the uncertainty beneath it. "That is where I am taking you," he confirmed. "You will have your own room in the main house, and my sisters will be glad of the female company. Martha complains constantly that she is drowning in brothers, and Rebecca will probably talk your ear off about books within the first 5 minutes of meeting you. You will help with cooking and cleaning and whatever other household work needs doing, and in return you will have a safe place to live, 3 meals a day, and fair wages that will be yours to keep when your contract is up." "Fair wages," Stella repeated, and he could hear the disbelief in her voice. "The contract says—" "I do not care what the contract says," Marcus interrupted. "You are not a slave, Stella Morrison, and I will not treat you as one. You will be compensated for your labor, just like anyone else who works on the Emmett Ranch. Is that understood?" She stared at him for a long moment, and then, to his surprise, her eyes filled with tears. She blinked them back fiercely, but one escaped to trace a path down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. "You do not know what this means to me. I was so afraid standing up there on that block. I thought my life was over." "Your life is just beginning," Marcus said, and was surprised to find he believed it. He reached across the table and, after a moment's hesitation, took her hand in his. Her fingers were small and cold despite the warmth of the restaurant, and he squeezed them gently. "I promise you, Stella, you are safe now. Whatever happens from this day forward, you are safe." She nodded, more tears spilling over, and Marcus signaled for the waiter to wrap up the leftover food. He paid the bill and then helped Stella into her coat, trying not to notice how perfectly her hand fit in his, or how his heart seemed to beat a little faster when she smiled at him. They walked back through the cold afternoon streets to the hotel where Marcus and his brothers were staying, a modest establishment that was nevertheless clean and well kept. The hotel owner, a jovial man named Ferguson, raised his eyebrows when Marcus asked to rent a second room, but asked no questions when Marcus paid in advance for the night. "My brothers should be back soon," Marcus told Stella as he showed her to the room, which was small but comfortable, with a real bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the main street. "We will introduce you properly at dinner, and then tomorrow we will start for the ranch. It is about a 2-day ride, so we will need to stop overnight at the way station, but that is a respectable place run by a good family. You will be safe there." Stella set down the bundle of leftover food and looked around the room, and Marcus saw her shoulders relax for the first time since he had lifted her off that auction block. "This is too much," she said softly. "A room of my own, new clothes, food. You have already spent so much on me." "Not nearly what you are worth," Marcus said, and meant it. "Now you should rest. You have had a difficult day and we have a long ride ahead of us tomorrow. I will come get you when it is time for dinner." He left before she could protest further, closing the door gently behind him and standing in the hallway for a moment to collect his thoughts. What had he done? He had set out this morning intending to buy supplies and maybe a few head of breeding stock if he found a good deal. And instead, he had spent $50 on a contract for a woman he did not know and would now be responsible for. His brothers were going to think he had lost his mind. As if summoned by that thought, he heard familiar voices in the hotel lobby below and descended the stairs to find Thomas and William arguing good-naturedly about something while Ferguson looked on with amusement. "There you are," Thomas said when he spotted Marcus. "We have been looking all over for you. Ferguson said you came back an hour ago, but your room was empty." Thomas Emmett was a big man, bigger even than Marcus, with their father's red gold hair and their mother's blue eyes. He had the kind of face that looked stern until he smiled, and then it transformed into something warm and approachable. William, on the other hand, was leaner and darker, taking after their mother's side of the family, with quick hands and a quicker temper that had gotten him into more than one scrape over the years. "I was settling someone into a room," Marcus said, and saw both his brother's eyebrows rise in perfect synchronization. "Before you say anything, let me explain." He told them the story quickly and without embellishment. The auction, the girl with bare feet, the bid, the trip to the general store and the restaurant, and the promise he had made to bring Stella back to the ranch. Thomas listened with his arms crossed and his expression thoughtful, while William's face went from incredulous to angry to reluctantly impressed in the space of a few minutes. "You paid $50 for a 6-month contract," William said when Marcus finished. "Marcus, that is more than we were planning to spend on supplies for the entire winter." "I know what it cost," Marcus replied evenly, "and I would do it again. You did not see her, Will. She was standing up there without shoes in December, and Henderson and Worth were circling like vultures." "What was I supposed to do, walk away?" "You were supposed to remember that we are running a ranch, not a charity," William shot back, but there was no real heat in his voice. "Though I suppose if you had to go and rescue someone, at least you picked someone who can actually cook. God knows we could use the help after last week's disaster with the burnt beans." Thomas held up a hand to forestall further argument. "What is done," he said in his practical way. "And honestly, Marcus is right. We do need help at the ranch, especially with Martha and Rebecca still learning how to manage a household. If this Stella can cook and clean, she will more than earn her keep. But we should meet her properly before we leave tomorrow. Make sure she knows what she is getting into." "She knows," Marcus said. "I explained everything. But yes, we should all have dinner together so you can see for yourselves that I have not completely lost my senses." They dined that evening in the hotel's small restaurant, and Marcus watched his brother's expressions carefully as Stella was introduced. She was nervous, he could tell, her hands twisting in her lap beneath the table and her voice soft when she answered their questions. But she met their eyes squarely and spoke honestly about her circumstances and her willingness to work hard at the ranch. Thomas warmed to her immediately, his natural kindness responding to her obvious vulnerability, and even William, who had been skeptical at first, seemed impressed by her straightforward manner and the fact that she did not simper or play coy. By the end of the meal, both brothers had given Marcus subtle nods of approval, and the tension that had been riding his shoulders since that afternoon finally began to ease. That night, lying in his hotel bed and staring at the ceiling, Marcus found his thoughts drifting back to Stella again and again. To the way she had looked standing on that auction block, so small and alone against the cold. To the relief in her eyes when he had draped his coat around her shoulders. To the strength in her voice when she told him her story, refusing to be pitied even as she accepted his help. He told himself it was just natural concern for someone in a bad situation, the same feeling he would have for any person in need of rescue. But some part of him, some deep and honest part that he could not quite silence, whispered that it was something more. He pushed the thought away and closed his eyes, willing sleep to come. Tomorrow they would start the journey home, and there would be plenty of time to sort out his feelings once they were back at the ranch and life returned to normal. Except he had a feeling that with Stella Morrison under his roof, normal was going to be a relative term. The morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of December day where the sky was so blue it almost hurt to look at, and every breath turned to frost in the air. Marcus and his brothers loaded their purchases onto the pack horses while Stella waited in the hotel lobby, dressed in her new clothes with her borrowed belongings in a small bag that Mrs. Chen had thrown in with the rest of the purchases. "You ever ridden a horse?" Thomas asked Stella as they prepared to depart, and she shook her head. "Not really. My brother let me sit on his horse once when I was young, but that is the extent of my experience." "Then you will ride with Marcus," Thomas decided. "He has the steadiest mount and you will be safest with him. William and I will handle the pack horses." Marcus brought his horse, a big bay gelding named Rusty, around to the front of the hotel and swung up into the saddle. Then he extended his hand down to Stella. "Put your foot in the stirrup and give me your hand," he instructed. "I will pull you up behind me." She looked dubious but did as he said, and a moment later she was settled behind him on the horse, her arms wrapped tentatively around his waist. Marcus tried to ignore the way his body reacted to her proximity, the warmth of her pressed against his back and the whisper of her breath against his neck. "Hold on tight," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "It is a long ride and the trail can be rough in places." They rode out of paradise as the sun climbed higher in the sky, following the road north toward the mountains that rose like jagged teeth against the horizon. The country was beautiful in its harsh way, all sage brush and scrub pine and red rock formations that glowed like embers in the morning light. They passed other travelers on the road, freight wagons heading to the mines, a family in a covered wagon making their slow way west, a lone rider who tipped his hat as he passed. Stella was silent for the first hour of the ride, her grip on Marcus's waist gradually relaxing as she grew accustomed to the rhythm of the horse's gait. Then, tentatively, she asked, "How long have you lived in Nevada?" "All my life," Marcus replied, glad for the conversation to distract him from his too acute awareness of her presence. "My father brought my mother out here in 1855, right after they married." He had heard about the silver discoveries and thought he could make his fortune, but he ended up ranching instead when the mining did not pan out. "I was born in 1857, the first of their 5 children. And you have always worked the ranch." "Since I was old enough to sit a horse," Marcus confirmed. "My father taught us everything he knew about raising cattle and managing land. When he died, the responsibility fell to Thomas and me to keep the place running. It has not been easy, especially with the droughts and the harsh winters, but we have managed to hold on." "It sounds like a good life," Stella said softly. "It is," Marcus agreed. "Hard but good. There is something satisfying about working the land, about building something with your own hands that will last beyond your lifetime. My father used to say that a man could measure his worth by what he left behind, and I think he was right." They stopped at noon to rest the horses and eat some of the food Marcus had purchased that morning at the general store. Stella walked carefully on her still healing feet, and Marcus made a mental note to check her bandages that evening at the way station. They sat on a fallen log and ate in companionable silence, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. "Can I ask you something?" Stella said after a while, and Marcus nodded. "Why did you really buy my contract? You said it was the right thing to do, but that cannot be the whole reason." "Plenty of people see injustice every day and do nothing about it." Marcus considered the question, turning it over in his mind. "I suppose," he said slowly, "it is because I could not stand the thought of walking away and spending the rest of my life wondering what happened to you. My father taught us that a man's character is defined by what he does when no one is watching, when there is no reward except the knowledge that you did right. And my mother, before she died, made me promise to look after people who could not look after themselves. Standing there watching you on that auction block, I knew that if I did not act, I would be breaking that promise." Stella looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "Your parents raised you well," she said finally. "They would be proud of the man you have become." Something in Marcus's chest tightened at those words, and he had to look away before the emotion showed on his face. "I hope so," he said. "I try to live up to their example, though I do not always succeed." "You succeeded yesterday," Stella said softly. "You saved me, Marcus Emmett." "I will not forget that." They reached the way station as the sun was sinking toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The station was run by a family named Cooper, good people who had been providing food and shelter to travelers for as long as Marcus could remember. Mrs. Cooper took one look at Stella and immediately swept her off to the women's quarters, clucking about the state of her feet and promising hot water for washing and a good meal. Marcus and his brothers saw to the horses and then joined the other travelers in the common room for dinner. The meal was simple but hearty. Venison stew, biscuits, and dried apple pie washed down with strong coffee. Stella sat between Marcus and Thomas, looking more relaxed than she had since Marcus had first seen her on that auction block, and he found himself watching her more than he probably should, noting the way she laughed at something Thomas said or the way her face lit up when Mrs. Cooper brought out the pie. After dinner, Marcus asked Mrs. Cooper if she could check Stella's feet and change the bandages, and the older woman agreed readily. "Poor thing," she said in a low voice to Marcus. "She has been through the ringer, has not she? But she has a strong spirit. I can see it in her eyes. She will be all right, especially with you looking after her." "I hope so," Marcus said, and realized with some surprise that he meant it more than he had meant almost anything. The thought of Stella suffering or being afraid made him want to hit something, which was a novel and somewhat alarming sensation. They slept that night in the common bunkhouse, men on one side and women on the other, separated by a curtain. Marcus lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of sleeping travelers and the crackle of the fire in the stone hearth, and thinking about the woman sleeping on the other side of that curtain. In less than a day, Stella Morrison had gone from a stranger to someone he felt inexplicably protective of, someone whose well-being mattered to him in a way he could not quite explain. He told himself it was just the circumstances of their meeting, the dramatic rescue and the vulnerability she had displayed. But deep down, in a place he was not quite ready to examine too closely, he suspected it was more than that. There was something about Stella, some quality of strength and grace under pressure that called to something in him. He had known her less than 24 hours, but already he could not imagine his life without her in it, and that realization kept him awake long into the night. The second day of travel was much like the first. Long hours in the saddle, brief stops to rest the horses, and the gradual transition from the harsh desert landscape to the gentler rolling hills and pine forests of the high country. Stella seemed more comfortable today, her grip on Marcus's waist firmer and more confident, and she asked questions about the land they were passing through and the ranch they were traveling to. "How big is the ranch?" she wanted to know. "About 5,000 acres, Marcus replied. "Most of it is open range for grazing, but we have a few hundred acres under cultivation for hay and feed. The main house sits in a valley with a creek running through it, good water year-round. There are outbuildings for the ranch hands, barns for the horses and cattle, and a good-sized vegetable garden that Rebecca tends. It is not fancy, but it is home." "It sounds wonderful," Stella said, and he could hear the longing in her voice, the desire for a place to belong that he recognized because he had heard it in his own voice once, years ago. They reached the ranch just as the sun was setting, the long rays of golden light illuminating the valley and making the white painted house glow like a beacon. Marcus felt the familiar surge of homecoming pride as they rode up the long drive, past the corrals where the horses whickered in greeting and the barn where the hands were finishing up the evening chores. The front door of the house burst open before they had even dismounted, and two young women came flying out, skirts billowing and voices raised in excitement. Martha reached them first, all wild red curls and freckles and boundless energy. "You are back. We thought you would be another day at least. Did you get everything we needed? Did you remember the sugar? Rebecca will kill you if you forgot the sugar for her baking." I remembered the sugar, Thomas assured her, swinging down from his horse and catching Martha in a hug that lifted her off her feet. And the flour and the coffee and everything else on that impossibly long list you gave me. Rebecca was more reserved, standing on the porch steps and smiling rather than rushing forward, but Marcus could see the relief in her eyes. She was the youngest of the Emmett siblings, and looked the most like their mother, with dark hair and serious gray eyes, and a thoughtful manner that made her seem older than her 17 years. "Welcome home," she called, and then her gaze fell on Stella, still sitting behind Marcus on the horse, and her eyes went wide with curiosity. "And who is this?" Marcus dismounted and then reached up to help Stella down, steadying her when her feet touched the ground and she swayed slightly from the long ride. "This is Stella Morrison," he said, pitching his voice to carry to where his sisters stood watching. "She will be staying with us for a while, helping with the household work. Stella, these are my sisters, Martha and Rebecca." Martha's eyes were sharp and assessing as she took in Stella's new clothes, her bandaged feet visible beneath the hem of her dress, and the way she stood close to Marcus, as if he was a shield against the world. But whatever she saw in Stella's face must have satisfied her, because she smiled suddenly, a wide, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. "Well, welcome to the Emmett Ranch, Stella Morrison. You are just in time for supper, and I hope you are hungry because I made enough stew to feed an army." I never can judge quantities properly. Rebecca came down from the porch more slowly, her expression thoughtful. She was quieter than Martha, but Marcus knew that still waters ran deep with his youngest sister, and she missed very little. "It is nice to meet you," she said to Stella, her voice soft but sincere. "I hope you will be comfortable here. We do not have much in the way of luxuries, but we try to make it a good home." "I am sure I will be very comfortable," Stella replied, and Marcus heard the tremor of emotion in her voice. "Thank you for welcoming me." The house was warm and bright after the cold darkness outside, oil lamps casting golden pools of light across the worn but clean wooden floors. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a big cast iron stove against one wall and a long table in the center surrounded by mismatched chairs. There were calico curtains at the windows and rag rugs on the floor, and the whole place smelled of wood smoke and cooking, and the indefinable scent of home. Martha bustled about, setting extra places at the table while Rebecca sliced bread and Thomas and William brought in the supplies from the pack horses. Marcus showed Stella to a chair and then went to help his brothers, but he found his attention wandering back to the house, to where Stella sat at the table being gently interrogated by Martha about her journey and her first impressions of Nevada. Over supper, Marcus told the full story of how he had met Stella, and he watched his sisters' faces carefully as he spoke. Martha's expression went from interested to outraged when he described the auction, and by the time he finished, she was practically vibrating with anger. "That is barbaric," she said flatly. "How can they just sell people like that? It is no better than slavery." "It is legal," Thomas pointed out, though his tone suggested he did not approve any more than Martha did. "Contract labor has been part of the territory since the beginning. People sell their labor to pay debts all the time." "That does not make it right," Rebecca said quietly, and everyone turned to look at her. She was staring at Stella with an expression of compassion that made Marcus's heart squeeze. "No one should be sold like property, whatever the law says." Marcus did the right thing. "I think so too," William said, surprising everyone. He had been quiet through most of the meal, but now he looked at Stella directly. "You are welcome here, Miss Morrison. This is a good place and we take care of our own." Stella's eyes shimmered with tears, but she blinked them back and smiled. "Thank you," she said. "All of you. I have never had much family, and what I did have is gone now. But you have all been so kind, so welcoming. I promise I will work hard and earn my keep." "I do not doubt it," Martha said briskly, standing to clear the plates. "But first, let us get you settled. Rebecca and I will show you your room, and then we can have some tea and get to know each other properly. The men can clean up for once." The men protested good-naturedly, but Martha was already ushering Stella and Rebecca toward the back of the house, where a small guest room stood ready. Marcus watched them go, feeling oddly bereft now that Stella was out of his sight, which was ridiculous because he had only known her for 2 days and she was perfectly safe with his sisters. "So," Thomas said, leaning back in his chair with a knowing smile, "she seems nice." "She is," Marcus agreed warily, recognizing that tone in his brother's voice. "Pretty too," William added, not even bothering to hide his grin. "Very pretty, actually." "What are you getting at?" Marcus demanded, though he knew perfectly well what they were getting at. "Just that you have been watching her like a hawk watches a mouse ever since we left paradise," Thomas said. "And I have never seen you spend $50 on anyone except family. It is clear you care about what happens to her, and that is fine. But be careful, brother. She is vulnerable right now, and the last thing she needs is for you to complicate her life further." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I am not going to complicate anything," he said. "I bought her contract to help her, not to. I mean, I would never take advantage." "We know," William interrupted, his voice gentler now. "We know you would never do that. But caring for someone and acting on those feelings are 2 different things, and right now Stella needs stability and safety more than she needs romance. Just keep that in mind." "I will," Marcus said, though privately he thought it was a bit late for that advice. He already cared for Stella, more than was probably wise given how briefly he had known her. But his brothers were right. Stella needed time to heal and recover from her ordeal, time to find her footing in this new place. The last thing she needed was Marcus pressing his attentions on her when she was still technically bound by contract to work for him. It would be taking advantage, no matter how honest his feelings. So he resolved to keep his distance, to treat her with kindness and respect, but nothing more. It was the right thing to do, the honorable thing. And if it left him lying awake at night thinking about brown eyes shot with gold and the sound of her laugh, well, that was his burden to bear. The weeks that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Stella settled into life at the ranch with a grace that surprised everyone. She proved to be an excellent cook, far better than Martha, whose culinary skills were adequate at best. She could bake bread that was light and fluffy, make stew that actually had flavor, and her pies became the stuff of legend among the ranch hands who found excuses to come up to the main house around dessert time. But it was not just her cooking that made her invaluable. She had a way of organizing the household that made everything run more smoothly. She helped Rebecca with the mending and taught her tricks for making clothes last longer. She worked alongside Martha in the vegetable garden, even in the cold of winter, planning for spring planting. She kept the house clean without being asked, and always seemed to know what needed doing before anyone else noticed. More than that, she fit. She laughed at William's terrible jokes and listened patiently to Rebecca's dreams of becoming a teacher. She rode out with Martha to check the fences and did not complain when the wind cut through her coat or the snow.